All right, everybody. It's good to see you. I'm going to stand here because this is abnormally high, the podium, but I wanted to start off by saying hello to everyone. I'm Deborah Yashar. I'm the director of Pierce and also professor in the politics department in SPIA, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you all to today's monthly Global Existential Challenges seminar. As you know, for those of you who are regulars in the room, sometimes it's taped, sometimes it's not taped. Today is one of those moments where it is taped, so of course be mindful of all those questions. And we're going to be focusing in particular today on global migration, national borders, and inclusion and exclusion. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I wanted to just say a few preliminary words and introduce them, and then they will have the floor. The question before us today, as you all know, is not new, although it is and remains fundamentally salient in a fundamentally political way. There are many ways to tack into this, but let me just note this. We live in a world of nation states, sometimes of empires that decide who is in and who is out. Moreover, we have a passport system, as Torpy wrote quite a while ago, that administers and regulates travel between states. And our international system overall reinforces these ideas of citizenship, national identity, and state sovereignty, and the right to regulate the rights of states and the movement of people. Yet, as we also know, and as Yashar has noted with this memorable phrase, birthright lottery, it often determines who has citizenship and how it is experienced, because where our citizenship or denizenship is defined is really a function of where you just happen to be born. It's not a function of your merit or a function of what you've actually done. It literally is defined by where you're born, and that is a kind of birthright lottery, and one where you're born grants citizenship in highly divergent ways around the world. So again, no matter where you are, you might be granted citizenship, but where you live might vary enormously in terms of whether or not it's democratic or autocratic, whether or not it's peaceful or war-ridden, whether or not there's high inequality and precarity, or greater opportunities for growth and development, whether or not it's a space prone to natural disasters, or one cleaved by many social cleavages and discrimination and the like. So I start there as a background, not because it's new, but just to remind us of these deep and fundamental questions that provide the backdrop to why we should not be surprised that there are patterns of global migration and patterns of sovereignty and patterns of inclusion and exclusion, ones that are only exacerbated by the contemporary crises that we oftentimes experience, whether or not it's war or poverty or famine or climate change or oppression or discrimination. Of course, this is a long-standing question, and people are the ones who get caught in the middle of these big theoretical and policy debates. And of course, this is not just a question elsewhere, it is a question that has been fundamental to what is happening in this country in particular. So Pierce is really delighted to sponsor this panel. It actually has sponsored conversations around migration for quite some time. It sponsored the Migration Lab that is now housed at the Center for Migration and Development, and that Patricia Hernandez-Kelly has run for quite some time in a really excellent way. And today, as part of that effort and as part of this series on global existential challenges, we have three terrific speakers who I presume are known to you all, but I'm still going to say a few words about them nonetheless. They're a wonderful group of faculty, both as scholars and teachers, with various joint positions in the effort to be multidisciplinary, of course, as this panel is, of focusing on politics and sociology, SPIA, and UCHB. All of them have written award-winning books and articles addressing the themes of this panel. I'm not going to mention all of them, but I encourage you to go to their websites. They are plentiful. And they have really taught and mentored many of our students in fundamental ways. So let me tell you who they are. Annie Stilz will be the first one up. She's the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Politics in the University Center for Human Values. Her research focuses on questions of political membership, authority and political obligation, nationalism and self-determination, rights to land and territory, and collective agency. She also has a strong interest in modern political thought. Let me just highlight two books that she has written in particular. One that came out in 2009 is entitled Liberal Loyalty, Freedom, Obligation, and the State. The second is entitled Territorial Sovereignty, a Philosophical Exploration, both of which speak to these questions in really fundamental and interesting ways. And she's also the editor-in-chief of Philosophy and Public Affairs and co-editor of the Social and Political Philosophy line at the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy, and also many other things. I'll stop there. Acclaimed and important scholarship. Rafaela Dancygier also has an incredible CV as well. She's a professor of politics and international affairs and is also currently the director of the Bobst Center for Peace and Justice. She specializes in comparative politics of advanced democracies, and her research examines how social and economic divides interact with party politics and shape electoral alignments and political conflict, particularly focused on Europe, Western Europe, and the United States. She too has 2 books. I'll mention both. The first, Immigration and Conflict in Europe. The second, Dilemmas of Inclusion, Muslims in European Politics. And she's written many articles that cover topics such as hate crime and immigration, radical right populism, gender equality, housing crises, and gentrification, and also has done some work on refugees. And third, but definitely not last but not least, is Filiz Garip, professor of sociology and public affairs, and her research lies at the intersection of migration, economic sociology, and inequality. And within this general area, she studies the mechanisms that enable or constrain mobility and lead to greater or lesser degrees of social and economic inequality. She's trained as a sociologist, but by the way, also has an engineering background and uses many different kinds of methods to ask these questions. Her book, On the Move, Changing Mechanisms of Mexico-U.S. Migration, in fact, investigated with many different methods the Mexican migration flow that changed the face of the United States over the last 50 years, and she too has published very widely across many different journals. Let me note that this past year, she was also named to the Census Bureau Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations, which is also really quite interesting, and like Annie, is interested in climate mobilities, and, both from a theoretical and an empirical perspective. So we have an incredible panel before us. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 15 to 18 minutes or so, and we'll open it up to the Q&A. One of our panelists has to leave at 1:15, but we will stay in the room until about 1:20 or so. So I'm going to turn it over to Annie. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here and talking on these topics. So what I'm going to do is present just a little sliver of a project I'm working on climate displacement. So by contributing to climate change, industrialized states are shrinking the supply and also changing the character of the world's habitable spaces. And those changes quite drastically increase the threat of environmental displacement. So, a recent paper that I put up here on the slide predicts that by 2070, expected temperature increases under a business as usual kind of scenario could leave 30% of the globe's population outside what they call the human climate niche that people have occupied for millennia. And estimates of the impacts of these changes vary quite a bit, but recent modeling by the World Bank suggests that without prompt climate action, more than 216 million people could be forced to migrate already by 2050. Now, since climate change compromises the Earth's habitability, it raises a whole host of important normative questions. So what does the international community, and especially high-emitting states, owe to people who are at risk of climate displacement? When might people justifiably raise claims to settle in, or even perhaps to govern over new areas, or to be compensated by other communities for changes to their lands? So to think about the impacts of climate change on migration and land use, we might consider, for example, farmers in Guatemala, whose livelihood is vulnerable to droughts and unpredictable storms. Or we might think about the coastal inhabitants of Bangladesh, which is sometimes forecasted to lose up to 11% of its land due to sea level rise. Now, the vast majority of people who may be displaced by climate change will likely migrate internally, moving to other areas within their own countries. But not everyone. We might also think about the inhabitants of Kiribati, which is on the left picture on the slide, which at least without major adaptation projects, may well become uninhabitable by mid-century. And these are people who might be permanently displaced across international borders, and they face the loss of their citizenship, their territory, their political institutions. So what is the best strategy for securing the interests of people like these who are at risk of climate displacement? And in particular, I want to ask whether we should assist people in securing those interests where they live now, or whether we should instead be enabling them to relocate. And should we think about that question just with reference to a kind of a cost comparison between those two options, or are there other relevant considerations here? Now, most existing proposals out there in the literature focus mainly on relocation. So because poor countries are unlikely to be able to afford adaptation measures like reinforced coastal protection or changes in agriculture or massive irrigation schemes, it's often argued that migration should be prioritized for communities in the Global South. So consider, for example, the climate refugee approach. Now, reacting to the fact that most climate migrants actually fail to qualify for protection under the 1951 Refugee Convention, many observers have proposed identifying some individuals as climate refugees and granting them special relocation rights. So sustainability scholars Frank Bierman and Ingrid Boas argue in a quite highly cited paper that people who are affected by sea level rise, by extreme weather events, and by drought or water scarcity should be considered climate refugees and enabled to relocate elsewhere. Some scholars of migration, though, have criticized this climate refugee proposal on the grounds that because migration typically has multiple causal drivers, it's just too difficult in practice to pinpoint climate change specifically as the main cause of a person's decision to migrate. Since climate change exacerbates pre-existing economic and social and political factors that already influence migration, there's often just no very good answer as to who we should count as a climate refugee. So a second dominant policy discourse, the migration as adaptation approach, argues instead for the adoption of general labor migration policies for individuals from climate impacted areas. So poor households that face environmental stress often adopt an income diversification strategy that involves picking one family member to go and perform wage labor outside the community. And building on that practice, advocates of migration as adaptation argue for the adoption of both internal and cross-border and often kind of temporary or circular labor migration policies for individuals from climate impacted areas. And they argue that the income from migrant remittances will make vulnerable families and also the broader communities that they live in more resilient, and they may also finance the community's adaptation in place. So while I don't deny that migration has an important role to play in addressing climate displacement risks, I believe that these proposals actually fail to offer a just response to projected climate impacts. And instead, I think that where possible, a just response to climate displacement should focus on taking measures so that people can stay in place and they can maintain their citizenship and their local communities if they wish to do that. I'm not arguing that people should be forced to stay, but I am arguing that people should not be required to move if adaptation in place is genuinely feasible for them. So, in my view, we have a positive duty to underwrite the global conditions of habitability for those at risk of climate displacement. And we should execute that duty by instituting mandatory taxation to fund in situ adaptation for people who are at risk of climate displacement. And I think primary responsibility for discharging that duty should fall on high-emitting states, alongside other actors who are responsible for climate change, like fossil fuel corporations and high-emitting individuals. So even if relocation would be less costly, I think that high-emitting states and these other agents should bear the additional burdens required to support people remaining in their homes. So why should we prefer adaptation to relocation? Well, I think because it better protects people's territorial rights. Specifically, two rights that I've argued for elsewhere, and I call the rights of occupancy and the right to collective self-determination. So I believe that people have a right to stay in the geographical locations where they reside, a right that I call the right of occupancy. And it's wrong to require people to migrate involuntarily because it violates this right. So occupancy draws our attention to the ways in which individuals' central life projects are often bound up with specific geographical locations. Geography and climate can affect the economic and subsistence practices that people take up, making it very difficult for them to pursue those practices in some different place. Religious, cultural, and recreational activities often have territorial components. And finally, people form personal bonds with other people, and they enter into work and religious and friendship arrangements, in part because they expect to remain spatially arranged in certain ways. In addition to this right of occupancy, I also think people have a right to collective self-determination. We ought to respect people's right to rule themselves through political institutions that reflect their values and commitments, and to maintain their citizenship and to collectively determine their own future. Now, requiring people to move involuntarily, as many relocation proposals would do, I think threatens both of those rights. So first of all, many people don't wish to move. When people are involuntarily relocated, that often undermines their central life projects. It can mean drastic changes to their career and their livelihood. It can detach them from the social and cultural and educational organizations in which they're invested. And it often severs their personal relationships with their family, their friends, and their neighbors. In Kiribati's case, it will mean the loss of lands that are essentially connected to Kiribati cultural practices. So climate displacement threatens people's occupancy rights, and it can also threaten collective self-determination, as in the case of Kiribati. Kiribati is a sovereign country, so to require its inhabitants to move is to rob them of their homeland and their citizenship. Second, people's ability to undertake planned migration varies quite dramatically with their level of advantage. So the poor, the older, the less educated, the less employable segments of the population are usually the least able to migrate. Migrants tend to be self-selected. They tend to have capital and skills that are of interest to their destination countries, and they're not usually among the poorest people from their home areas. Women also tend to be less mobile than men, in part due to care expectations. So a climate strategy that prioritizes relocation overlooks the immobile, who may become trapped in undesirable places to live, losing their ties to more advantaged family, friends, and communities in the process. And third, relocation requires host communities, many of whom will not be responsible for climate change, to bear unshareable non-monetary costs. So for example, Kiribati has acquired land that may in the future be used for relocation to Fiji. But many local Fijians worry about that the arrival of these climate migrants could prove detrimental to them. Erosion is already a problem in Fiji, and it will worsen greatly with an influx of up to 100,000 new inhabitants. Although fish is a major component of the Kiribati diet, local fishing rights right now are reserved for indigenous Fijians, so traditional practices would have to be significantly revised to accommodate the newcomers. Now, I assume that inhabitants of a host community have valid moral complaints only about harms to their comprehensive social practices when those practices are not unjust. So, for example, a racist who values living in a whites-only environment has no claim not to have his plans set back through the migration of new Hispanic residents to his neighborhood, because a commitment to a whites-only environment is an unjust commitment. But the projects of Fiji's inhabitants are morally permissible projects. Traditional Fijian sociocultural practices do not violate any duties of justice. And so a relocation strategy risks compromising not only the territorial interests of the people who are relocated, but also the territorial interests of the host communities who take them in. So instead of requiring people to relocate, I think that high-emitting states have a positive duty to underwrite the global conditions of habitability for those who are at risk of climate displacement by instituting mandatory tax levies to fund adaptation in place. And I'd be happy to say more about a responsibility to bear the cost of adaptation funding in question. But just to briefly sort of state my view about that, I think that most climate impacts are foreseeable and avoidable results of states' large-scale social policy choices. So I think that we should attribute high-emitting states as corporate agents liability to compensate for the climate displacement risks that they've caused, perhaps alongside other high-emitting agents like individuals or firms. And that's going to tell in favor of funding a global adaptation framework, mainly through mandatory levies on high-emitting states. Now, I don't think an arrangement like that would require a world government. I think it's something we could put in place through multilateral treaty, perhaps a treaty organized along the lines of what William Nordhaus has called a climate club. So Nordhaus suggests combining a voluntary agreement between several countries with trade sanctions on those who refuse to participate in the treaty. If a few large countries were to initiate an international adaptation tax scheme, they could apply a uniform percentage tariff on the goods of non-participating countries. And similar kinds of trade sanctions could be used to stabilize the agreement, penalizing countries who refuse to pay their tax obligations under it. Now, it might be objected that people who propose climate migration measures aren't necessarily opposed to prioritizing adaptation. Instead, maybe they just see relocation as a response to situations where adaptation proves to be impossible. But it's not actually clear that this is the case. So, for example, Bierman and Boas extend climate refugee status to people facing extreme weather events, drought, and water scarcity. But people facing drought might prefer support for irrigation systems and heat-tolerant crops rather than a right to relocate. And likewise, people facing extreme weather events might prefer disaster-resilient housing, early warning systems, and public shelters. Most social scientists who work on the impacts of natural disasters stress that the harm that they cause is mediated by the state of a community's public infrastructure and their socioeconomic background conditions. And likewise, migration as adaptation advocates typically don't insist that high-emitting states provide adaptation interventions alongside labor migration visas. Now, to be sure, even on my own view, adaptation funding should not preclude migration options for people who face climate impacts. So I think high-emitting countries should also institute climate visa programs for areas that suffer from land degradation. But I think that support for adaptation has to be provided alongside those measures in order to ensure that people are not effectively forced to migrate as their land's habitability becomes increasingly compromised. A decision to migrate is voluntary only if migrants enjoy sufficiently good living conditions and opportunities at home, so that people who wish to stay are not compelled to leave. But if real opportunities for adaptation are provided, then labor migration can enable people at risk of displacement to shape their adaptation choices according to their preferences. But migration as adaptation is not usually conditioned, as I think it should be, on the provision of in situ adaptation funds. So will a mandatory adaptation tax scheme and a climate visa regime prove to be infeasible? Well, even if we think that states will only sign on to treaties that are very clearly in their material interests, still I think the desire to avoid massive future flows of irregular climate migrants and destabilizing territorial conflicts do provide quite powerful material incentives for states to create an adaptation tax scheme and to manage climate migration through regularized visas. It's definitely true that these measures are not going to happen right away, and they won't happen without the efforts of activists to bring pressure to bear through dramatization, civil disobedience, and other kinds of resistance. But still, I think there's reason for optimism about adaptation taxes and climate visas as a long-term goal, and I think we should be advocating for it. So adaptation may prove difficult, especially over long time scales for people who are threatened by sea level rise and erosion especially. And so this is not going to be a complete proposal. There's also going to be need for a just domestic and international climate relocation regime that can handle these cases of inevitable displacement. But I've gone too long, so I won't try to tackle the normative issues around how that should be structured.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Rafaela is next.
Okay, thank you, Deborah, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for coming to this talk. So as Deborah mentioned, I've worked on immigration and hate crime as part of my research agenda for quite some time. Move the microphone. Yes. So I've worked on, is this better? On immigration and hate crime for quite some time. These are issues that have interested me since graduate school. And one of the things that I could never really quite wrap my head around was this issue of hate crime and violence against refugees. Not necessarily that it exists, of course, we know it exists, unfortunately, but there's often this assumption when hate crime occurs that these are lone individuals and they maybe have some psychological pathologies, maybe they belong to really extremist organizations, and so on and so forth. But that didn't really seem to cohere with what I was reading when you would read about some local events when these hate crimes actually happen, because often it seemed like there was a substantial community of support behind these seemingly sort of random acts. And in fact, when you read more about these things, you see that they're actually not very random. The literature on hate crime, criminologists, they've started to distinguish different types. And yes, some might be what we might call random. Somebody just has an aggressive personality and wants to beat somebody up. That does exist. But more often than not, these crimes are embedded within dynamics that are occurring within a community. And they're often responses to perceived threats or retaliations for perceived slights and so on. But at the end of the day, what I saw a lot in a lot of the qualitative research was this idea that yes, these perpetrators, they're kind of normal individuals, quote unquote. They don't have a swastika tattooed on themselves. Some might, of course, but most don't. Many are just regular kids, often sort of between the ages of 15 and 25, and they're almost often men, young men. But again, there didn't seem to be anything too extreme actually about these people, and certainly not about the communities that they were embedded in. And so, while reading about these individual cases and hearing about sometimes when you read a newspaper article about these sort of regular communities of support, I thought, well, I mean, we should really kind of have a better sense of how widespread is support for anti-refugee violence, for instance, or hate crime against gays and lesbians and so on, and other marginalized groups. We should have a sense of, if these acts keep on occurring, is it really sensible to assume that this is a product of community support? Because if it is, the policies that also flow from this are quite different, right, than if it's the outcome of a few quote unquote deranged or deviant individuals. And just to give you a sense of the data, this labeling is not just a hate crime against refugees, but it's a large part of this figure. It goes back all the way to the late 60s, and what you can see, or 1970, I guess here, and what you can see is this steep rise. Some of it is because data requirements have changed and reporting has become better, but we know also from communities and from people in the field that this number has been going up quite a bit. This is in Germany. I'm going to show you some other results for Germany, but we can see similar patterns for other settings. It's extremely difficult to find good data on these things because often in the US, for instance, it's not actually required to report these data. And so we don't have a great picture, but from what we know and from the data that is being tracked in the United States, for instance, there has been an increase in hate crime in the last 5 years, especially after Trump was elected. But he was not the only problem. There were other factors. So before I show you the next slide, as I was starting to think about determinants of community support, I started to look at surveys, opinion surveys, to kind of see, well, what have people asked? Can you even ask people that, right? Can you ask people, agree or disagree, I would like to beat up an immigrant, right? Does that make sense? I mean, these are the actions that we are talking about. And so I developed a survey along with some colleagues here at Princeton where we did ask really specific questions about support for anti-refugee violence. I'm not going to talk about it here. We developed a bunch of different measures to test this experimentally to kind of tease out, are people hiding their support? Can we take their opinions at face value? So for now, I'm just going to show you the straight up opinions because we found that, yes, you can actually take opinions at face value. I'm going to move over just a second. The questions are very explicit, right? So when it comes to the refugee problem, violence is sometimes the only means that citizens have to get the attention of German politicians. Attacks against refugee homes are sometimes necessary to make it clear to politicians that we have a refugee problem. Hostility against refugees is sometimes justified, even if it ends up in violence. Xenophobic acts of violence, this is in the German translation, is a very common term, are defensible if they result in fewer refugees being settled in town. So these are very explicit questions that we ask. Again, we also ask them in sort of a little bit of a devious way as sort of the people carrying out the survey were trying to deceive some respondents to make sure that they really give us the true response, and the results are the same. And in terms of distribution of support, you can see that it's actually quite high, right? So, for instance, 19% say that hostility against refugees is sometimes justified, even if it ends up in violence. And even 14% say it's okay to commit violence against refugees if it means that not as many are going to be settled in town. Right? So to Annie's point, these local communities are very often not very receptive to inflows. And I should note the survey was taken in 2016-17. This was just after Germany and the rest of Europe had experienced large refugee waves from predominantly Syria, but also from Iraq and Afghanistan. And that also set off, even though Germany initially was quite hospitable and there was a lot of leadership to integrate refugees, there was also a really important backlash that led to a far-right party entering parliament for the first time since the war. So these are the overall distributions. Next, we want to know, is this basically a bunch of young men, right? Is it just a predominance of young, uneducated men, maybe women, endorsing these opinions, and that kind of coincides with the perpetrator types, which we do know from research are predominantly young men. And so next I'm going to show you a graph that shows the support correlations. I'm not going to do that with every single question. I picked the homes question, which says attacks against refugee homes are sometimes necessary to make clear to politicians that we have a refugee problem. First, looking at gender. So 50% would mean, half are men, half are women in terms of supporters. And we see that just over half of supporters are men of that statement, but it's almost evenly split between men and women, right? So even though we know that women don't really commit hate crime, they're definitely important supporters behind the scenes, which, by the way, is a general theme when we think about extremist politics. Often you have the men out front, and the women do a lot of the coordinating and facilitating work in the background. Of course, you also have far-right leaders like Marine Le Pen and others, but this is a very common theme when we think about fascism and extremism, that the women aren't really front and center, but they're still very important. Age, actually the majority are not young, although with the caveat that this is a survey of 18-plus respondents, so we don't have young teenagers here. But nevertheless, you see that a large share are 40 and older, and I'm going to show you some more differentiated data next. And then finally, it's wrong to think that this is the product of low income and socioeconomic marginalization. Whether you're poor or rich, you're just as likely, more or less, to support hate crime. This is not how it's portrayed in the media or even in research. Next, I'm going to show you all 4 questions in a little bit more detail. So here, I know this is too small for you to see probably, but the dots always refer to the 4 different questions. You can kind of see that they cluster together. And you can see that, again, male and female, not much difference. Age group, it actually ticks up a lot when you go to the 30 to 39-year-old age group. So again, it's wrong to think that this is a product of youth. And household income, right, nearly flat. As you move up in the income distribution, it's not the case that you see less support for hate crime. Here I've broken this down by education. That's the only, I don't want to call it, it's not a solution. Education is not a solution because you still have 10% supporting hate crime among the most highly educated respondents. But at least we do see a gradient here, whereby as people get more educated, they do reject hate crime at higher rates. And finally, I'm going to show you graphs broken down by age and gender and education. I want to see, okay, we know young males are most likely to commit hate crime. Is it the case that young and especially uneducated males are really supportive of hate crimes? And yes, we see that. And strikingly, over 40% sometimes of young men with low education support violence against refugees in the survey context.
And for women, we see a similar pattern, even if a bit depressed. So one of the conclusions of this research, and this is other people have remarked on this as well, is we have this tendency both as sort of regular citizens, as academics, as maybe pundits, to talk about extreme behaviors and to single out behaviors that are normatively extreme and clearly undesirable as the product of deviancy and sort of something that's not part of general society. But in fact, what do we make of these acts when we see that people who we would normally think are in the mainstream of society, high-income, educated people, they're supporting these acts? Not a majority for sure, but 15% or so. This is not sort of a blip. What do we make of these behaviors when we do see a large minority supporting these acts? And of course, if I were to break this down by certain geographic regions that witness a lot of hate crime, you see the support going even higher. And one of the really important things that I've talked about citizens, but in a lot of my other research, I focus on elites. And one of the key things that elites have to do in this regard is to seriously condemn these acts. And instead, what we often see is maybe you have followed recent attacks in the UK where refugees have been settled. There's an asylum home that went up in flames, or like a hostel. And this happened because there were some rumors that refugees were sleeping in luxurious bedding and so on. And rather than saying we categorically condemn these acts, politicians would say, not all of them, but many, and mainstream politicians would say, oh, it's not actually true that they're sleeping in luxurious bedding, as if that would make any difference in terms of setting a refugee home on fire, right? So they're already legitimizing these concerns by saying, no, wait, it's not true. They're not being treated any better than you are. And so this is often lacking. And in the second part of this project, which I didn't show you today, we actually experimentally changed the positions of politicians to see whether politicians who endorse violence against refugees, whether they're able to both increase their vote share, but also or repel supporters who really don't like the endorsement of violence. And we do find that if you endorse hate crime as a survey respondent, you're also much more likely to support a politician who does. That might not be all that surprising, although of course unnerving. But at the same time, if you belong to a party who is sort of on the radical right and you're actually not in favor of anti-refugee hate crime, these statements don't repulse you. You're just as likely to vote for these candidates as if, compared to candidates who say, no, anti-refugee violence, it's not okay. And so this is sort of a sign that it really pays off at the elite level for some, of course, not for all politicians, to take these positions. And as next steps, what we're trying to do is to kind of figure out these feedback effects between elites and voters and citizens, because clearly it's wrong to think of this just as a bottom-up phenomenon. It also comes from elites, and elite endorsement of these acts further turns these acts into mainstream behavior rather than behavior of an extremist fringe. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm losing my voice a little, so that's why it's cracking up. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So thank you, Deborah. Thank you to Piers for putting us together. I've already learned a lot from Annie's presentation. I also talk about climate mobilities, and it's been totally depressing to hear about Rafaela's findings. It's just awful, because we always make a distinction between refugees and economic migrants, which is arbitrary, but somehow you think the humanitarian reasons will compel people to feel sympathy. And to see the shares here is just disheartening, to say the least. So I want to argue today that we tend to think about climate-related migration as a relatively new phenomenon, but in fact, different regions have experienced this kind of events over our history, and we can actually look back and understand the drivers underlying migration by looking at it from this historical perspective. So I'm going to present some findings from a project that I've been working on for the last few years. And for that, I collaborate with a group of economists and environmental scientists. And we're trying to understand how much of the Mexico-US migration movement can be attributed to weather-related events over time. And we think this is a really interesting case, in part because of the long history, but also because we have so much data that we have accumulated over decades on mobility of people, both within Mexico and across the border. We also have data from many regions in Mexico that have experienced different kinds of weather regimes over the years. So we think that by looking at it historically, we can identify not just whether people are migrating, but what kind of events lead to what kind of mobility, with what kind of duration. Is it the same thing to experience 1 year of drought versus 3 consecutive years of drought? Do people return? So there's a lot to be learned from that. And we also want to correct this expectation that many of us have built. So recent work shows us that over the last 15 years, at least 300 million people in the world have been displaced due to weather-related or climate-related factors. But all of that number comes from within country flows. So somehow we've built this expectation that, yes, climate mobility will happen, but it's mostly going to remain within country borders. So it's going to be internal displacement. So by looking at Mexico-US case, we can actually already see that that's not the case. Under certain circumstances, cross-border mobility is not only possible, it's actually a very likely response to pressures. So let me give you a little bit of a background. I don't think anybody needs it here, but Mexico-US migration is still, in these days, the largest sustained international movement of people between any two countries. And it's always existed, but we've also seen this mass mobility in the 1980s and 1990s. So if you look at 1980, there were about 2 million Mexican-born people living in the US. In 2010, that number had risen to 12 million. And about half of these Mexican-born people are undocumented. So the big question that many of us have asked over the years is, what brings these people here? And we've actually come up with many convincing explanations, but environmental factors have been blatantly missing from these explanations. So let me give you a very brief overview of how we thought about this. So one explanation has been historical. In early 1900s, rail lines start to connect Texas border to big cities in central western Mexico, and employers from the US go to Mexico to bring back workers. And then these kind of labor arrangements become formalized in the 1940s with the Bracero program, which lasts about 20 years. And it's a temporary labor agreement, and about 5 million Mexican workers come as a result of that. Now, another explanation builds off of this historical pattern and talks about social and cultural factors that build over the years. So even if Bracero program comes to an end in the 1960s, you've now created this web of social ties connecting people in Mexico to to employers and destinations in the US, and it's become a cultural expectation to migrate in many of these communities, so migration persists. And of course, the economic rationale or the economic explanation is always there. There's differentials between the two countries. You can more than double your wage, regardless of your education level, by just crossing the border. Now, what about environmental factors? And when I say environmental factors here, I want to just hone in on a particular mechanism. And that mechanism is agricultural in the US setting, in the Mexico setting. So basically, extreme weather conditions make it harder to grow crops, and communities that are dependent on this agricultural productivity will suffer losses, and as a result of that, they might choose to migrate. So how do we study it? I'll be very brief here. So we use a survey that's now housed in Princeton, the Mexican Migration Project, that's been ongoing for over 30 years. We have information from about 140,000 individuals in Mexico. 20,000 of them have migrated at least once to the US. Many more have moved within Mexico. And we combine this with very detailed weather information that is provided as part of a NASA service called PayMet. And this gives us very detailed daily measurements of temperature and precipitation patterns on every kilometer square grid on Earth. So we're combining these, and by looking at this data, we can already see what kind of changes have been happening in Mexico. I'll give you just one example. So this map is showing number of days over 30 degrees Celsius in Mexico. So these are considered extremely hot days that are detrimental to crop growth. So if you have many of those days in sequence, that really affects the yield that you're going to have. And here we're seeing this data from year 2000, and we're displaying in a very particular manner. So we're basically comparing each community to its own self in the 1980s. How much off were you in terms of this measure in year 2000 compared to where you were between 1980 and 1985? So basically, we're not comparing Arizona to New York, we're comparing Arizona to its own self, New York to its own self. And we can already see that the yellow and red colors mean that you were hotter than what you were in the 1980s. So this is not a very long period. It's only been 15 years since 1985. And most of the communities have experienced more heat than they had in the past. And in fact, some of them, with the dark red ones, have experienced at least 2 standard deviations more hot days than they used to. So this is telling us that even though we're not looking at 100 years, we're still seeing a lot of changes in Mexico. And we can see it over the years, less rain or more sporadic rain, or less rain combined with extreme rain. So more volatility and more heat in Mexico. So what are the impacts of these on mobility? Again, we're trying to hone in a particular mechanism, which is rural productivity. And many of these communities are dependent on corn, which is the most important crop in Mexico. And still, to this day, 80% of corn production is rain-fed in Mexico. So you're basically at the mercy of weather. And we wanted to hone in on this mechanism and look at whether rainfall or temperature patterns during corn-sensitive periods, its growing season, made a difference. And again, it's like you can go to the deep end with these questions. There are different regions in Mexico with different corn calendars. So in most of Mexico, May to December is when corn is planted and harvested, but other areas are hotter or cooler. So this kind of schedule shifts. So we basically created customized measures for different regions, and we computed weather deviations from the baseline normal period, as I discussed in the map. Now, what did we find? So it's not surprising, as we would expect, agricultural loss is a mechanism for the kind of weather impact we're observing on migration. So when we see extreme decline in rainfall in a community, it's immediately followed by increased US-bound migration. Now, consistent with this agricultural mechanism, we see that what matters is not the rainfall in the entire year, but rainfall during a very specific period when corn is sensitive to weather. We also see that irrigated communities are actually prone or more immune to these effects, and it's the not irrigated places in Mexico that experience the greatest impact. Now, we also see these effects can intensify over time. Now, what do I mean by that? So if your community experiences 2 consecutive years of drought, even if you did not give much of a response in the first year, you see this immediate jump in the impact. And these type of intensification effects are, again, concentrated in places without irrigation. Now, Annie alluded to this. There's also a lot of heterogeneity by household wealth. Not everybody has the option to move because it's still very costly to cross the border, especially after 1990 when border enforcement increased and many migrants need smugglers to navigate the dangerous terrain. We see that wealthier households can respond more quickly to adversity. So they're the ones moving. And wealthy here is a generous term. The assets people own in these communities are very modest. 80% of households in our sample own nothing, and the remaining 20% own a piece of land, or maybe they own a room, a couple of rooms that they live in, or maybe they own a little business. But even that kind of modest wealth makes a difference in who's able to move and who's not able to move. So for poor households, it takes a lot more adversity and many more years to be able to migrate to the US as an adaptation strategy. So this is kind of one question. Do people migrate or not? Yes, they do in response to weather. But weather also affects other decisions that migrants make that can be very important. So in this map, I'm showing you where migrants start off in Mexico and then where they end up in the US. And then you can see that they're not taking the shortest path across the border. So they're not just going straight up, but they're taking very particular paths. And Border Patrol actually divides our border into 9 different sectors. And we have information on how many Border Patrol officers are on each sector, what are the number of apprehensions, and sadly, what's the death rate at different sectors of the border. And as a shorthand from the data, we can see that the places that are more heavily patrolled are typically places that are safer terrain, in part because we're sending Border Patrol officers there. This means that the more Border Patrol focuses on a particular sector, the more this pushes migrants to more dangerous terrains and pushes them to take higher risks, which increases the death rate. Now, the question we're asking here is, let's say you experienced a weather shock and suddenly you're credit constrained. Does this make you take higher risks in crossing the border? And the answer is yes. Weather shocks really affect where migrants cross from and what kind of risks that they take. But these effects need to be considered in relation to other policy decisions that we're making. And one is border enforcement. Again, border enforcement's presence is also increasing the risks. And also the changes created by NAFTA. So NAFTA, especially in agricultural communities, when it was signed off in the 1990s, created this immediate shock because it allowed for corn imports from the US. So we're also trying to understand how this kind of policy decision fares in relation to other things that we cannot control, like weather effects. And again, there's kind of a differentiation by household wealth. We see that when it comes to risky decisions through kind of dangerous terrain, poor are more likely to choose that, whereas wealthier households can buy their safety, way to safety by hiring smugglers, even under dangerous terrain. So the final question we asked was, what happens once migrants are here? Do they still care about what's happening back home? And here we looked at undocumented migrants only, and this is about 85% of migrants are undocumented in our sample. So we see that continuing extreme weather back home is making them delay their return decisions. In other words, it's making people stay longer here, which tells us that they're still watching the conditions back home, and unless they are favorable, they're not returning back. Now, Annie mentioned this. We can think of migration as an adaptation strategy to weather shocks, but it's not available to everyone. And our border policies are actually making it very hard for people to rely on this strategy. Our colleague Michael Oppenheimer at SPIA with Helen Benveniste have written this amazing paper that shows that it's not just a Mexico-US case, but the mobility is mostly in the world. International mobility is occurring from places that are more vulnerable to climate change to less vulnerable places, wealthier places. But then other restrictions that we're putting on mobility is making it unlikely that this adaptation strategy will be available to everyone. And then we need to think about our migration policies and trade policies in the same ways as well. Trade policies are also, I didn't talk about this much because it's preliminary work, but we see that the adversity experienced by weather is exacerbated by external pressures that come from trade in the aftermath of NAFTA. So I'll stop here. Thank you again for including me.
Invite our panelists to join us up here. It's also the first panel I've ever run where people kept their time. So
All right. Any questions or comments that people might have?
Hi. Hi, I'm Victor. I'm a film fellow from Singapore. I'm a disability scholar, so I'll ask the disability question. I see that there's a lot of the trinity of race, class, and gender features a lot in all three panelists' work, which is excellent. So I wonder if the speakers could also speak about disability in your respective work, given how questions of disability, able-bodiedness are also central to notions of productive citizenship and also consequently exclusion, inclusion, and migration.
Thank you. Why don't we take a few questions and then we'll come back?
Yeah, I was very pleased that Rafaela gave us some good news about education having a positive effect on people's ideas and behavior. But I wonder if you've had a chance to either do or read someone else's work on why that's the case. What is it about education? Is it the socialization process in schooling? Or is it the sense of security that it might give people? What is the magic here? And how might we extend that?
Hi, first of all, thank you very much for all the panelists for the great presentations. So I have a question for Andy about the mandatory taxation program. So I wonder, you mentioned that high emitting states should bear most of the responsibility for the taxation. I wonder how you measure the high emission. So whether it is about past emission or you're talking about current emission. If you're talking about past emission, then I wonder if you can talk more about how, like, why should the current generation be responsible for something that they have no choice about? And if it is about current, then the problem would be how do you account for like developed countries which already like had most of their emissions because of like the past industrialization, whereas like currently the less developed countries are those who would be bearing the burden. And this relates to the problem about feasibility. So you talk about the desire to avoid a massive flow of migration would be a reason why countries would want to opt in. And I wonder, so this seems to depend upon whether that country would be expecting the massive flow of migrants or whether they're expecting a massive taxation for that. So in this sense, different countries would have a different calculation, and one of the calculation that might relate to the past and present emission would be if like developed richer countries have like higher like bargaining powers to say, well, they are not currently emitting and therefore they should have less emission. So I wonder whether there would be a worry here about if you are like it ends up being the less developed country who end up bearing most of the taxations because of how international relations bargaining goes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to recommend that we start with Rafaela since you're going to have to leave early and then we'll come down.
Okay, great. I'll take your question. I think the others probably have more to say about the issue of disability.
Can everybody hear?
Oh. Okay, I'll take your question, Nancy. Thank you. So the short answer is no. I don't have an answer for you. However, I because this is not how the study was set up, and so I can't speak to this directly. However, there is research that shows, I mean, it could also be that's really not education. It's just the type of people who happen to get an education are just much more open-minded and more tolerant to begin with. That doesn't seem to be the case. We don't know about hate crime attitudes, but when it comes to immigration attitudes more generally, there's been a couple of papers that make use of sort of a policy change where countries extended education by a year or reduced it by a year, and so kind of randomly assigned who gets the extra year of education. And they compare views about immigration, and they do find that even just an extra year of education raises people's tolerance and acceptance of immigrants. Now, that still doesn't tell you what is it. It's not the self-selection, and so there's various theories about learning about new ideas and being exposed to not necessarily more cultures, but just more things, right? More difference. But I have not seen work that really puts a fine point onto that question.
Can I just ask a follow-up since you are going to have to step out? The work that you presented was based in Germany.
Deborah.
Oh, you want to hear this too. So my question was just before Rafaela has to skip out. The work that you presented was based in Germany, but I'm wondering if this work that you've done, the findings that you presented also have a similar pattern in other places in addition to Germany.
The reason why we did this study because there is no survey at all like this. Like we have never seen, to our surprise, anyone asking these questions. And I have not carried out the survey elsewhere because I didn't bring this up, but this is actually 4 waves. We asked people 4 times. We wanted to make sure their views didn't change too much over time. So it took a lot of money to do this. So that's part of the reason why we haven't done this elsewhere. But levels of hate crime are really high in other settings too. So I don't have an ex ante reason to think that support levels are much lower. But I don't know that for a fact.
Thanks so much. So on the disability question, I mean, I don't work mostly or mainly on disability, but I do think disability is another factor that we should take into consideration when we think about people's abilities to migrate and the costs and burdens associated with migration, which might impact differentially on different people. So it's another really important axis of kind of background variation when we think about this problem. On Elaine's question about taxation and adaptation costs, so ideally, I think that we would tax both current emissions and historical emissions. So above some level of emissions that are necessary to guarantee a decent life for one's citizens, I think emissions should generally be taxed, which would mean I think even China's emissions that are above that level should be taxed now. So I support carbon taxes, but I also support taxation, sort of liability for historic emissions in addition to that, which would mean the United States would be liable not just for what it emits today, but what it has emitted in the past. Why should current generations be expected to bear those costs? Well, industrialized countries have become very wealthy through their emissions, and I think their current populations benefit from that fact. And I don't think it's unfair for people who benefit from an organization to also have to bear costs to discharge the liabilities that the organization might have to people it's harmed. I don't think those costs should become so large that they jeopardize people's ability to lead a decent life. So there's some cap. And would that impact the feasibility of a taxation scheme? It might. I should probably think more about that consideration. One thing I would say is that I wouldn't insist that an adaptation tax scheme, it would be good if we got some adaptation tax scheme, even if it wasn't perfectly just according to my principles. Some adaptation tax scheme would be better than no adaptation tax scheme. And so there's kind of a question about, at what point does the just become an enemy of the good there?
I can just say one thing about kind of the empirical patterns related to disability. So I showed you this graph that shows increase in migration, and it almost perfectly tracks increase in enforcement, because after 1986, the US signed Immigration Reform and Control Act, which increased our border enforcement budget and so on and so forth, and it's kind of kept increasing after that. So that has actually changed the age structure of who's able to migrate, because if you're going to be an undocumented migrant and you need to cross these dangerous terrains, it's become a younger person's game. And actually, in the 1990s, almost 70% of all first-time migrants are teenagers, so really, really young people. And then a related point is that when you hire smugglers, basically, if women and children are charged more than able-bodied men or men who are considered to be stronger. So I think there are all these gradients that restrict the mobility of people related to their ability. So.
Well, that relates a little bit already to my question. Sorry, I came from another meeting and I'm delayed. But I found Filiz's presentation absolutely fascinating, and I was completely triggered by the term adaptation strategy, because I compared weather and the unbills of weather to conflict, and I wonder whether there is any difference on generational level, that those who adapt to the weather or to deal with it are those who can do the harvest and leave the elderly and here. Whereas if you have a conflict, you try to take the whole family out. So that's what I wanted. So whether there's this generational thing, yeah.
Before you answer, let's take Paul's.
So this is a question for Filiz also. So you mentioned that irrigation has a mitigating effect. How big is that effect? And is that just the kind of adaptation strategy that would most easily lend itself to reducing this kind of flow? Or is it just it's just a small thing and it really wouldn't make that much difference?
We'll take one more question, and that actually ties back to Annie's comment too about responsive. Anyway, I'll let you guys answer this. One last question.
Hi, thank you all so much for your presentations. I was wondering if any of you might have more to say about the kind of climate realities that migrants experience or encounter upon their settlement in the U.S. So given some of the factors that you all named in terms of class, race, income, etc., are certain migrants from certain areas may be more vulnerable to experiencing, say, environmental racism or other kind of climate realities here in the U.S.?
So I am going to ask Rafaela if she wants to say anything else before she does have to leave now. Did you want to say anything?
Climate questions, I'm happy to.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. And why don't you go next?
I mean, I think it's an excellent question about conflict. So one of the reasons I, started this project was to see if there was something unique about environmental change that you observe year after year. Is it different from a regular economic crisis? Like in the 1980s, Mexico experienced devastating economic circumstances that impoverished a lot of families. But is there something different about weather that at some point you give up? And then it becomes more like the conflict. And I think there's a couple of things happening. There's first kind of this generational change of farming families, children don't want to work in farming. There's that. There's kind of smallholder farming is becoming less profitable and less feasible. So I think when it combined with these things and when it becomes impossible to do it, I think we will see this major shift in people. And then because people now, the undocumented migrants are staying longer. So this is a very new phenomenon. If you look at data from 1990s, 80% of undocumented migrants left within a couple of years. But now, more than 70% of undocumented migrants here have stayed more than 10 years. So this is a new phenomenon. So as you grow roots here, then you start bringing your family back as well. So I think we have entered that phase where it's not just a few years strategy of, you come back and forth and then you hope it will be better, but it's becoming a more permanent settlement pattern, and in part created by the border enforcement, counterintuitively. And then the impact of irrigation, it's actually no effect versus positive effect. So if you're living in an irrigated community, weather does not make any difference. So I don't know. I think we should try if irrigation can prospectively give people an option to stay there, because I can't quite rule out if there's something specific or different about irrigated communities and not irrigated communities. So if we go into like these deeper questions of should we build more irrigation, I would want to see kind of more rigorous tests of that. But in our data, we see no effect versus a big effect. So it does make a difference.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so I might speak to the environmental racism and kind of a question. One very interesting other part of my work that I didn't present here today is just about which groups of people face greater climate impacts, even in industrialized countries like the United States. And people are differentially exposed based on factors like class, ethnicity, and race. So often people may, move away from a climate-impacted area, but have to settle in another climate-impacted area in the host country. And interestingly, the United States is already having climate relocation programs that are ongoing right now. And those have primarily impacted racial and indigenous minorities. So, it does raise this question of, are people really escaping, or might they face similar conditions even once they migrate, just because of the class and racial structure of the receiving society and where they're going to fall in those social hierarchies. So I do think it's a really important issue.
Let me just wrap. Oh, I'm so sorry. We do need to end, but let me just wrap this up by saying it's always good to end when there are more questions, but I apologize to those whose questions we can't take. And I want to say, first off, not just that this was a great set of presentations, which they were, but all of them kind of pushed us to think about challenging the trope that migration is always a positive choice, an easy choice for people, that they leave because they can always imagine better circumstances, as if it is a instrumental decision without costs. And Annie highlighted the normative challenges and questions about justice that really maximize people's choices, which might lead them to want to stay if the circumstances were to change. I think that Phyllis's work also highlighted that the choices are never easy and the capacity to move is never easy. And Rafaela's also highlighted how difficult it is, even if you make it across the border, the kinds of violence that you experience, even amongst those who you might not expect to act in those sorts of ways. So the challenges are significant. We clearly didn't resolve all the questions, but I think bringing this multidisciplinary group together really enhanced the conversation. We look forward to many more. Thank you so much.